What happens when a 9-year-old boy boards a flight, ticket in hand, only to be told by a stranger that he doesn't belong in the very seat his family paid for? What would you do if your dignity was questioned at 30,000 feet, if your worth was dismissed before you even buckled your seatbelt? This is not just a story about a stolen seat. It's about a moment when the quiet calm of an ordinary flight shattered into a storm of entitlement, prejudice, and unexpected courage. A white passenger's arrogance collided with a black child's right to be seen. And in the middle of the chaos, a father's strength and a boy's unshakable resolve turned humiliation into a lesson the entire world was forced to confront. But how did it all escalate so quickly? What was said in those tense minutes before the flight was grounded, and what lasting change could possibly come from one child holding on to his seat? Stay with us as we unfold the gripping, emotional journey of Noah and Darius Carter aboard Flight 1783. Before we begin, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss the stories that reveal not just what happened, but why it matters. The boarding gate of Transatlantic Airways Flight 1783 buzzed with the kind of energy only an early morning flight could carry. Rolling suitcases thumped against the carpet, gate announcements echoed through the speakers, and the smell of burnt espresso from a nearby kiosk drifted faintly across the waiting area. People looked impatient, already burdened with the day ahead, and yet eager to reach their destination. Among them was a boy, 9 years old, quiet and steady, walking with his boarding pass clutched carefully in his hand. His name was Noah Carter. His backpack, worn but sturdy, hung from his shoulders. A small patch of the Millennium Falcon was stitched across the back pocket, something his father had sewn on himself, with a kind of patient pride only a father could carry. Noah had a way of moving that felt different from the other kids his age. He wasn't loud, he wasn't restless. He observed. He had an old soul wrapped in a young body. The gate agent glanced at him, scanned his pass, and said, "First class. 2A? Enjoy your flight?" The words sounded mechanical, routine, but to Noah, they meant something. Seat 2A wasn't just a place to sit. It was his place earned, assigned, and waiting for him. The first-class cabin was already filling when Noah stepped through the door of the aircraft. The soft hum of air circulation greeted him. Leather seats stood in neat rows, polished, with little pillows resting on them like promises of comfort. He looked at his ticket again, 2A. He turned toward the left, toward the window seat he had imagined sitting in since yesterday, when his father reminded him, "That seat belongs to you. Noah, don't let anyone make you feel otherwise." But when Noah arrived, the seat was already occupied. A boy, maybe a year older, sat with his Nintendo Switch in hand, legs dangling carelessly off the edge. His shoes tapped against the bag tucked beneath the seat. Next to him stood a woman, his mother tall, sharply dressed in a gray blazer and pearl earrings. Her name was Linda Whitman. She didn't wait for Noah to speak. She glanced at his boarding pass, then at him, and smiled a smile that wasn't kind. It was the kind of smile that dismissed, the kind that closed a door rather than opened it. "This is our seat," she said firmly. "You must be mistaken. Why don't you check with the flight attendant?" Noah looked down at his ticket, then back at the glowing number above the seat 2A. His heart thumped. He wasn't mistaken. "I think this is my seat," Noah said softly. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a sincerity that should have been enough. Linda's son, Ethan, didn't even look up from his game. The beeps and clicks of the console filled the silence. Linda exhaled sharply, as though Noah had just inconvenienced her entire day. "Sweetheart," she said, lowering her voice just enough to sound condescending. "Sometimes kids get confused. First class isn't really for, well, it doesn't matter. Why don't you sit over there?" She gestured toward an empty aisle seat in the second row. Noah's grip on his boarding pass tightened. He remembered his father's words at breakfast that morning. Darius Carter, his father, wasn't just a businessman. He was a man who carried weight with every word, who reminded Noah that dignity was something no one could take away unless you handed it to them. But what should he do now? Noah glanced around the cabin. Other passengers were watching, pretending not to. A man in one seat glanced at his phone to avoid eye contact. A woman across the aisle sipped her champagne as if nothing unusual was happening. Silence became complicity. A flight attendant approached, drawn by the tension. Rachel Lee was young, in her mid-20s, with the look of someone still learning how to balance procedure with instinct. She smiled politely. "Is everything okay here?" Linda pounced on the question. "Yes, we're fine. This young boy is confused about his seat assignment. We're already settled in." Her tone was brisk, her smile sharp. She didn't even give Rachel a chance to look at Noah's ticket. But Noah held out the boarding pass anyway. His hand was steady, even though his stomach wasn't. "It says 2A. He whispered. Rachel hesitated. She could feel the weight of the moment. Her eyes flicked between Linda, tall and assertive, and Noah, small but resolute. She opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again. Training told her to de-escalate, to avoid conflict, to keep the cabin calm before takeoff. And yet, there it was, the quiet truth in Noah's voice. Linda leaned closer to Rachel, lowering her voice. "It's fine. He'll sit somewhere else. My son is already here." Rachel froze, caught in the middle. Noah's chest tightened. He thought about pulling out his phone. His father was just one call away. One call, and everything could change. But he also remembered what Darius had told him that very morning as they ate scrambled eggs and toast. Strength isn't about raising your voice the moment someone doubts you. It's about knowing when to let the silence speak and when to let your voice carry. So Noah stayed quiet, for now. The aircraft door closed. The hum of the engines deepened. The world outside the window blurred with rain as the plane pushed back from the gate. Noah sat in the aisle seat Rachel had reluctantly offered him, his backpack tucked beneath his legs. From where he sat, he could still see seat 2A, his seat occupied by Ethan, whose game beeped happily on. Linda leaned back in her seat, satisfied, as though the matter had been resolved. But Noah knew it wasn't over. He knew this wasn't the end of the story. Because sometimes, silence wasn't surrender. Sometimes, silence was the gathering of a storm. The engines roared softly as Flight 1783 taxied across the wet tarmac. Noah Carter sat in the aisle seat that had been given to him instead of his rightful place by the window. His boarding pass still rested in his hand, slightly crumpled from how tightly he had held it. The numbers printed in bold, 2A, stared back at him like a quiet accusation. He wanted to move. He wanted to stand up and walk to that seat to tell Linda Whitman that she was wrong. But he stayed still. His father's words lived in his head like music that never faded, "Choose when to be seen." Noah adjusted the straps of his backpack, pulling it closer to his chest. The backpack smelled faintly of laundry detergent and peanut butter crackers. He remembered his father slipping the snack pack into the pocket that morning. "Flights are long, son. Always carry something that reminds you of home." The memory of breakfast rose vividly. Their kitchen was filled with the golden light of the Texas sun, the smell of toast and scrambled eggs heavy in the air. His father, Darius Carter, sat across from him in a crisp white shirt, sleeves rolled up. Despite being one of the most powerful men in the country, he poured orange juice into Noah's glass himself. "You're flying alone this time," Darius had said. His voice was deep but calm, a voice that could soften storms. That means you will see things differently. Some people will treat you like you belong. Some will treat you like you don't. You have to decide what that does to you. Noah had chewed on his toast, thoughtful before asking. What if someone tries to take my seat? Darius had smiled faintly, a shadow of pride in his eyes. A seat is just leather and metal. Noah, what matters is whether you give away your dignity along with it. If that day comes, you remember real strength isn't yelling or proving someone wrong in front of strangers. Real strength is patience. It is choosing the exact moment to let the world see you. Those words weighed on Noah now as the plane lifted into the sky. He could feel the thrust in his chest, the tremble of the fuselage as it climbed above the clouds. Outside the window, city lights disappeared into a sea of gray mist. In front of him, Ethan Whitman laughed quietly at his game. The digital sounds clashed with the hush of the cabin. Linda sipped champagne, her pearl earrings catching the light from the overhead lamp. She looked pleased, as if her maneuver had been nothing but clever parenting. Noah lowered his eyes, pretending to study the safety card in the seat pocket. Inside, though, his thoughts churned. Was this what his father meant, to let people walk over you until the right time? How would he know when that right time was? A flight attendant rolled the service cart down the aisle. Rachel Lee's polite smile masked her unease. She had seen Noah's ticket. She knew the seat was his. Yet, she had done what procedure told her, keep things calm. Noah noticed the way her hand lingered for a second when she poured water into his cup, as if to say, I see you. He appreciated it, but it wasn't enough. The cabin settled. The glow of seatbelt signs dimmed, and people reclined into their private spaces. The hum of engines became background noise, like a heartbeat of the sky itself. Noah stared at the screen in front of him, but he didn't press play on any movie. His mind was elsewhere. He thought about the time his father took him to a basketball game. They had courtside seats, the kind most kids only dreamed about. A man had bumped into them, muttering under his breath, "They give these tickets to anyone now." Noah had flushed with anger, ready to shout back, but Darius placed a hand on his shoulder, steady as stone, and whispered, "We don't answer ignorance with noise, we answer with presence." Minutes later, the camera had panned to them during halftime. The crowd had cheered. Noah remembered the warmth of that applause, not because of the man's insult, but because his father showed him the difference between reaction and response. Now, on this plane, Noah wrestled with that same choice. He imagined calling his father. Just one button. His phone was tucked inside the backpack, screen locked but ready. He knew Darius would pick up, no matter the meeting or the time zone. He knew that if he told his father what happened, things would change immediately. Linda would be forced to move. The crew would apologize. Maybe the whole flight would stop until justice was restored. But was that strength, or was that just using his father's power as a shield? Noah stared at his hands, small but steady. His nails were bitten short, a nervous habit he had tried to quit. He clenched his fists and unclenched them, feeling the rhythm of his pulse. He whispered silently to himself, "Not yet." The decision burned inside him. He hated sitting in the wrong seat. He hated feeling invisible. Yet, deep down, he sensed his father was right. Sometimes the world needed to underestimate you. Sometimes being overlooked was part of the plan. The flight continued quietly. A woman in 3B asked for an extra blanket. A man across the aisle ordered bourbon, his voice too loud. The cabin was ordinary again, but for Noah, nothing felt ordinary. Every breath carried the weight of choice. Linda glanced back at him once, her eyes cold, as if daring him to protest. Noah held her gaze for a moment. He didn't flinch. He didn't look away. For a split second, something unsettled flickered in her expression. Maybe she saw it too, the storm quietly building behind his calm eyes. Time stretched. Clouds gave way to sunlight breaking through the window shades. Noah leaned back, his backpack pressed against his knees, his mind replaying his father's lessons. He thought about dignity, about silence, about power that didn't need to be shouted. He thought about when to be seen. And for now, he chose patience. But in the pit of his stomach, he knew this moment wouldn't last. Something was coming. Something bigger than a stolen seat. Noah closed his eyes, steadying his breath. He imagined his father's voice again. The world will try to push you into corners, son, but the corners are where light finds its sharpest edge. He opened his eyes. Outside the window, the plane cut through clouds like a blade through fabric. The sky was endless. And Noah, though just a boy, carried the kind of strength most adults never understood. He didn't need to speak yet, but when he did, the whole cabin would listen. The cabin had settled into its mid-flight rhythm. Glasses clinked softly as attendants handed out drinks. The scent of warmed bread drifted from the galley. From a distance, everything looked calm. But at seat 2A, tension hummed beneath the surface like an electrical current. Noah Carter sat in his reassigned aisle seat, body still but mind racing. Every time he glanced forward, the sight of Ethan Whitman lounging in his seat pricked at him like a thorn. Ethan had kicked off his sneakers and stretched across the leather, oblivious to the storm brewing around him. His switch beeped cheerfully, tiny explosions lighting up the screen. Linda Whitman leaned toward the aisle, speaking to Rachel Lee, the flight attendant who had returned to check on first class. Linda's voice carried the clipped precision of someone used to being obeyed. "As I said, everything is fine," Linda insisted. The boy was simply confused. "We've sorted it out." Rachel hesitated, her tray balanced carefully in her hands. She glanced at Noah, who still held his boarding pass like a lifeline. The bold letters 2A remained visible. Rachel knew. She had seen it before. She had chosen the path of least resistance earlier. But guilt pressed harder now. "Ma'am," Rachel said quietly, "the passenger's ticket does say 2A. I just want to confirm." Linda cut her off with a sharp laugh, smooth but dismissive. "Oh, please. Do you really expect me to make my son move? He's already settled in. Look at him." She gestured at Ethan, who didn't even glance up from his game. "He'll be restless and miserable if you shuffle him around now. Surely you understand." Rachel swallowed. "I do understand. But nothing." Linda snapped, her smile turning brittle. "It's one seat. This boy can sit elsewhere. He'll survive." Noah felt the words sink into his chest like stones. This boy. She hadn't even used his name. She hadn't asked. To her, he wasn't a person with a ticket and a story. He was a problem to brush aside. He looked around. Other passengers were listening now. A man in one seat lowered his newspaper slightly, eyes flicking over the edge. A woman across the aisle tugged at her necklace. Uneasy, yet no one spoke. Their silence grew louder than any words. Noah breathed deeply, trying to steady himself. His father's voice echoed again. Presence, not noise. But he could feel heat rising in his face. He wanted to shout, to demand fairness. He wanted to ask why no one else seemed to care. Rachel looked at Noah, her eyes apologetic, then back at Linda. She seemed trapped, torn between procedure and conscience. "Why don't I bring another blanket for your son?" Rachel offered weakly, trying to redirect the tension. Linda nodded, satisfied, as though she had won. Noah lowered his gaze to his lap, his fists clenched around the boarding pass. He thought of calling his father again, the phone so close inside his bag. The temptation whispered one call, and it would all be fixed. But another voice inside him pushed back, not yet. The confrontation wasn't over. It was only beginning. Minutes later, Rachel returned with drinks. She placed sparkling water before Linda and juice for Ethan. When she reached Noah, she set down a can of soda and a small packet of pretzels. Her eyes met his briefly, soft with recognition, before she moved on. Noah opened the can slowly, listening to the hiss. He sipped quietly. He tried to focus on the fizz on his tongue, the salt of the pretzels, but each sound from 2A dragged him back. The click of Ethan's game, the rustle of Linda's magazine, their comfort built on his absence. Finally, Noah spoke, his voice quiet but steady. "That's my seat." The words slipped out before he could stop them. They weren't loud, but in the hush of the cabin, they carried. Linda looked up, eyebrows arched. "Excuse me." "My ticket says 2A," Noah repeated, holding it up. "That's my seat." The man in 1C lowered his newspaper completely now, watching openly. The woman across the aisle pressed her lips together. The cabin air seemed to grow heavier. Linda's smile sharpened. "We've been over this. You're sitting there. My son is comfortable where he is. End of story." Noah didn't flinch. His eyes met hers directly, and for the first time, her certainty wavered. Just a flicker, but it was there. Rachel stepped forward again, her voice softer this time. "Mrs. Whitman." Maybe it would be best if Linda turned to her. Voice rising. "Best for who?" "For this boy who doesn't understand seating assignments. My family paid for this flight too. I won't have my son inconvenienced because of a mix-up." Noah felt the weight of every eye in the cabin now. He could almost hear their thoughts. Should we step in? Should we stay quiet? He could feel their discomfort, their hesitation. And once again, no one spoke. Inside, Noah's heart pounded. He thought of his father again, of the lessons at breakfast tables and basketball games, of the reminder that dignity wasn't about yelling. But wasn't there a limit? Didn't there come a moment when silence became surrender? He tightened his grip on the boarding pass, edges digging into his palm. The decision pressed against him. Rachel looked torn, but before she could intervene, Linda leaned back in her seat, clearly finished with the discussion. "I won't argue about this anymore. He'll stay where he is." Noah swallowed hard. He felt the burn of injustice in his chest. He wanted to call Darius more than ever. He imagined his father's deep voice on the other end, calm but firm, reshaping the situation in an instant. He imagined the cabin falling silent as truth was revealed. But he didn't move. Not yet. The confrontation had grown sharper, the lines clearer. Noah sat there, a boy displaced, but not defeated. His patience was stretching thin, but his resolve was not broken. The engines hummed on. Drinks clinked again, but in the silence between those sounds, a storm was gathering. The cabin had grown unnervingly quiet, the kind of quiet that wasn't peace, but pressure. It was the silence of people who knew something was wrong, but lacked the courage to intervene. Noah Carter could feel it pressing against him from all sides. The hush of passengers sipping drinks, flipping magazines, or staring intently at their screens felt louder than any noise. He sat in the aisle seat that wasn't his, posture straight, eyes heavy with thought. In front of him, 2A gleamed like a reminder of what was taken. Ethan Whitman lounged comfortably in the seat, his head tilted toward the window as his game continued to beep and whir. Linda Whitman crossed her legs, flipping a glossy business magazine. She acted as though nothing unusual had happened, as if the boy beside her was invisible. Every page turn was deliberate, sharp, as though punctuating her victory. Rachel Lee passed through again with the service cart, her face professional, her steps measured. She paused near Noah, hesitating for a heartbeat, then moved on. She had chosen not to act, and that choice weighed heavy on her shoulders. Noah's fingers toyed with the corner of his boarding pass. He thought about tearing it in half, about abandoning the fight altogether. But he couldn't. His father's words pulsed in his chest. Dignity isn't disposable. The silence stretched. A man in 1C cleared his throat loudly, shifting in his seat. A woman 2 rows back whispered something to her husband, too faint to catch. The atmosphere in first class had shifted from casual comfort to a shared unease. Everyone had noticed. Everyone chose stillness. Noah's eyes drifted to the window across the aisle. The world outside was endless white, clouds stretching like blankets beneath the plane. He thought about how small he was in all of it, a boy in a sea of strangers. And yet, he felt something burning inside him, something larger than his size or age. He remembered another morning with his father, sitting on the porch swing at their Texas home. The air was warm, cicadas buzzing in the trees. Darius Carter had leaned back, his coffee steaming in hand, and said, "The world will always test you. Son, sometimes the test is loud, obvious. Sometimes it's quiet, like waiting to see if you'll break under silence. Don't break. Breathe. Hold your ground, even when no one claps for you." Noah had nodded then, not fully understanding. But now, inside this cabin where no one defended him, he felt the weight of those words. Linda shifted in her seat, glancing at him briefly. Their eyes met. She smirked faintly. A private signal of triumph. It wasn't loud, it wasn't spoken, but it was clear she believed she had won. Noah inhaled deeply, steadying himself. He looked away, but not in defeat. He was thinking, measuring. His silence was not surrender. Rachel appeared again, this time crouching slightly to check Noah's seatbelt. Her voice was soft. Just for him. "Are you doing okay?" she asked. Noah nodded once. He didn't want pity. He wanted fairness. But even that simple question gave him a flicker of strength. Someone had noticed. Rachel hesitated as though she wanted to say more, but a call from another passenger pulled her away. She straightened, smiled politely, and moved on. The minutes ticked by. The hum of the engines was steady, a background drum beat. Passengers shifted in their seats, ordered more drinks, laughed at muted comedies on their screens. Life in the cabin went on, pretending nothing was wrong. Noah felt frustration building, bubbling beneath his calm exterior. Was this what the world was like? People seeing injustice, recognizing it, but choosing comfort over courage. Was silence just another way of saying it was acceptable? He imagined what his father might say if he were here. Darius Carter would not have raised his voice, but his presence alone would have shifted the air. He carried a gravity that made people listen. Noah wanted to carry that too, even at 9 years old. He pressed his palms together in his lap, trying to focus. He told himself to be patient. His moment would come. Across the aisle. A woman finally broke the silence, her voice careful but clear. "Excuse me," she said, addressing Rachel. "I think the boy had that seat. Didn't he?" The words hung in the air like a spark. Heads turned. Linda stiffened, her smile faltering for the first time. Rachel froze, caught in the middle again. "There was a mix-up," she said carefully. "We're working to resolve it." The woman frowned, but said nothing more. She had opened the door, but she hadn't stepped through it. Her words drifted into the quiet, swallowed by it. Noah's heart raced. For a moment, he thought maybe others would join in. Maybe voices would rise in support. But the cabin returned to silence. The spark had died as quickly as it came. Noah leaned back, closing his eyes. He wasn't angry at the woman. At least she had tried. He was angry at the silence that followed, the silence that told him he was alone, inside, a war waged. Part of him screamed to stand, to shout, to demand justice. Another part whispered patience, whispered trust. He balanced on that edge, every second heavier than the last. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, startling the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Robert Hayes from the flight deck. We've been notified of a minor security concern, and as a precaution, we'll be monitoring the situation closely. Please remain seated, and thank you for your cooperation." Murmurs rippled through the cabin. Passengers shifted uneasily. Noah's eyes snapped open. A security concern. Was it about the messages he had seen Linda typing earlier on her phone? He remembered glimpses of her fingers flying across the screen, smug satisfaction on her face. He didn't know what she wrote, but something about it had felt wrong. Linda sipped her drink calmly, as though nothing touched her. But Noah noticed the tightness in her grip on the glass. The silence deepened again, now charged with suspicion. Passengers exchanged glances, whispered, but still avoided confrontation. Noah could feel the storm drawing closer. He touched the edge of his phone through his backpack, fingers trembling. He could end this. He could call his father right now. But again, he hesitated. Was this the moment? Was this the time to be seen? His chest rose and fell with steady breaths. He wasn't ready yet, but he was close. The cabin was silent, but inside, Noah Carter. A fire burned, and when it finally broke, silence would not protect anyone. The silence after the captain's announcement lingered like a weight pressing against every seat in the cabin. The hum of the engines filled the air, steady and relentless. But beneath that mechanical rhythm, Noah Carter's thoughts raced faster than any aircraft. He sat stiffly in the aisle seat that wasn't his small hands folded tightly in his lap. The boarding pass was still there, crumpled, its edges digging into his skin like tiny reminders of what had been stolen. Every time his eyes drifted forward, the gleam of 2A burned in his vision. That was supposed to be his place, his view of the sky, his right. And yet, there sat Ethan Whitman, tapping away at his game, oblivious, careless, shielded by his mother's will. Noah tried to sip his soda, but the fizz only made his stomach churn. He thought of his father, Darius Carter, sitting at their breakfast table with calm authority, reminding him to be patient, to measure strength not by noise but by timing. But how long could patience last before it twisted into something else, into surrender? His chest tightened with that question. He was 9, but he wasn't naive. He could feel the injustice clawing at him, telling him this moment wasn't just about a seat. It was about being seen or being erased. About dignity. He glanced at Linda Whitman. She sat upright, legs crossed, her magazine poised delicately in her hands. Every movement she made was intentional, designed to signal control. Occasionally, her eyes flicked toward him, a smirk dancing faintly at her lips. She didn't need to speak anymore. Her silence spoke louder. "You don't matter here." Noah looked away quickly, but the heat of her gaze stayed on him. He leaned against the armrest, trying to disappear into the leather, trying not to cry. But tears weren't what he felt. It was something sharper. It was anger. His fingers brushed against the zipper of his backpack, where his phone lay tucked inside. He imagined it again, pressing one button, hearing his father's voice on the other end. Darius wouldn't shout. He wouldn't need to. His words carried power, the kind that moved markets, grounded flights, and made entire companies rethink their foundations. Noah could picture it so clearly, the plane halting, Linda's smugness collapsing, the crew scrambling to fix what never should have happened, justice, swift and undeniable. But then another image crept in, passengers groaning in frustration as the plane delayed, strangers glaring at him, whispering about the boy who ruined their trip, headlines painting him not as the victim but as the troublemaker. He felt his stomach drop at the thought. What if they blamed him? The thought haunted him. He was just a child. Would they see him as a boy standing up for fairness, or as a problem to be silenced? He imagined people shaking their heads, muttering that he should have just stayed quiet. That fear weighed heavily, dragging him down, making him doubt. Noah pressed his forehead into his palm. His heart pounded in his ears. The conflict tore at him, one side urging action, the other warning restraint. His memory flashed again to his father's voice, deeper than thunder, yet calmer than rain. Strength isn't only what you show others, Noah. Strength is what you show yourself when no one else is watching. No one was watching now. Not really. The passengers were pretending to look away. The flight attendants were busy with their trays. Even Rachel, who had glimpsed the truth, had retreated into quiet duty. He felt invisible, but maybe invisibility was its own test. Noah shifted in his seat, sitting straighter, forcing his breath to slow. He let the anger settle, heavy but controlled, like a stone in his chest. He thought about what his father had said once on that porch swing. The world wants you to rush, to react. But if you can pause, if you can think while others shout, that's when your voice carries the farthest. Still, his doubts gnawed at him. What if patience was just weakness wearing a noble mask? What if silence only let injustice deepen? He glanced toward 2A again. Ethan had fallen asleep, his game dangling loosely in his hands. Linda draped a blanket over him, tender in her way. But when her eyes slid back to Noah, the tenderness vanished. It was replaced with the cold triumph of possession. Noah clenched his jaw. His father had told him never to hate, but in that moment he hated the way Linda looked at him. He hated how she reduced him to nothing more than a nuisance. He wanted to stand up, to shout, to demand the world see him. But he stayed seated. His chest rose and fell, each breath a battle. Rachel reappeared, collecting empty glasses. When she reached Noah, her hand paused. She leaned closer, her voice a whisper only he could hear. "I'm sorry." Noah's eyes widened. Rachel's gaze lingered for a heartbeat. "I should have said more," she added softly before moving on. Those words lit something inside him. Small, but real. He wasn't completely invisible. Someone saw him. Someone regretted staying silent. That gave him a measure of strength, enough to endure another moment, another wave of doubt. The cabin around him shifted back into its rhythm, laughter from a movie, the rustle of magazines, the clatter of ice in glasses. To anyone else, the flight looked ordinary. But inside Noah, the struggle raged. His thoughts turned toward the larger sky outside. What did it mean to be strong? Was it waiting? Was it fighting? Was it calling for help, or standing on your own? He didn't know. He only knew that his heart hurt, that his dignity demanded something, and that his father's voice whispered patience even as his own voice screamed action. The boy sat there, torn between two worlds, the world of his father's wisdom and the world of his own rising fire. Every second stretched, unbearable, like waiting for a storm to break. Noah Carter was just 9 years old, but in that cabin silence, he carried the weight of choices bigger than many adults ever faced. And as the engines hummed and the clouds drifted endlessly outside, he knew the time to decide was coming. Soon, he would either stay invisible or he would let the world see him. The hours of flight stretched onward, but for Noah Carter, time felt suspended. Every second in that seat was heavy, pressing on his chest. The hum of the engines had become a constant reminder of the limbo he lived in, present yet unseen, visible yet ignored. Linda Whitman reclined slightly, pulling her phone from her designer handbag. The glow of the screen lit her face, sharp and calculated. She typed quickly, thumbs moving with practiced ease. Her lips curved into the faintest smile, as though whatever she wrote was a private victory. Noah noticed. He couldn't help it. His eyes tracked her movements. It wasn't curiosity alone, it was instinct. He had always been observant. His father's words echoing in his head, watch the details others ignore. Details reveal truth. From his angle, Noah caught glimpses of the screen. Words flashed briefly before Linda tilted it closer to her chest, enough to catch fragments. Though, enough to understand the shape of her thoughts. Took his seat. Unbelievable entitlement. At least we'll be near the billionaire's son. The words stabbed at him, his stomach clenched. She knew who he was. This wasn't ignorance, it was strategy. She had taken his seat not just out of arrogance, but out of some twisted plan to brush shoulders with power, to gain proximity to the Carter name through his silence. Noah's hand trembled against the armrest. He wanted to leap up, to shout the truth, but he forced himself still. Instead, he leaned back, forcing his breath slow, eyes half closed as though he were drifting. But inside, his mind was racing. She knows, and she thinks it makes her untouchable. The thought gnawed at him. Linda typed again, rapid and unbothered. This time, Noah saw enough letters to piece more together. Security should check him twice. Something off about him traveling alone. Noah's throat went dry. Was she planting suspicion? The idea chilled him. His father had warned him that sometimes people wouldn't just dismiss him, they would try to make him smaller, even dangerous, in the eyes of others. And she was doing it, right there, with her manicured fingers on the glowing screen. A soft chime pinged above, almost unnoticeable. But the pilots noticed. Up front in the cockpit, a discreet notification flashed onto the onboard crew system. The airline security software monitored flagged language in passenger texts and messages when synced to the Wi-Fi network. Words like security, suspicious, entitled, they drew attention. Not always, but enough to alert. Captain Robert Hayes leaned forward, scanning the notification. His brow furrowed. He wasn't a man who liked surprises mid-flight. He tapped the console, sending a quiet message down the chain. A precaution, nothing more, he told himself, but his instincts pricked. Back in first class, the atmosphere remained deceptively calm. Passengers drank wine, tapped on laptops, watched muted movies. But for Noah, every breath felt heavier. His pulse beat against his temple. Rachel Lee passed through with the cart again, pausing when she saw Noah's pale face. "Are you all right?" she asked softly, her eyes narrowing with concern. Noah hesitated. He wanted to tell her everything that Linda had stolen his seat, that she knew exactly who he was, that she was typing messages that painted him as a problem. But the words lodged in his throat. Would she even believe him, or would she, like before, retreat into silence? "I'm okay," he whispered, but it wasn't true. Rachel lingered a moment, sensing his unease. Then, with a reluctant nod, she moved on. The minutes ticked forward. Linda set her phone down casually on the armrest, glancing once toward Noah. Her smirk returned, smug and untouchable. Ethan stirred slightly in his sleep, turning toward the window. Noah clenched his fists in his lap. The boarding pass in his pocket crinkled again. His father's voice haunted him. Sometimes patience is strength, but what if patience also let people like Linda win? What if waiting meant giving them time to twist the truth? The plane jolted slightly as turbulence brushed its wings. Overhead lights flickered. A murmur swept through the cabin. Noah gripped the armrest, steadying himself, but his mind barely registered the movement. He was too focused on Linda's phone. The screen lit up again with a new reply. This time, Noah couldn't read it, but the vibration of danger was unmistakable. In the cockpit, Captain Hayes received another ping. The flagged conversation had escalated. His gut tightened. He had flown countless routes, weathered storms, mechanical issues, and cranky passengers. But this was different. Something about it rang wrong. He pressed the intercom button, his voice filling the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We've received an advisory from our monitoring systems. As a precaution, we'll be coordinating with ground control. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We appreciate your cooperation." The cabin stirred uneasily. Passengers exchanged glances. Murmurs rose, thin and anxious. Some craned their necks toward the front. Others shifted in their seats, nervous but compliant. Noah's heart dropped. He knew without doubt Linda's messages had triggered this. His chest burned with panic and anger. If the crew believed her, if the system flagged him, what then would he be questioned? Pulled aside, his father's warnings echoed like alarms. The world will try to shrink you, to paint you as dangerous for simply existing. He pressed his hands together, palms damp. Should he speak now? Should he call his father, reveal the truth before things spiraled further? His phone seemed to vibrate against his leg, though he hadn't touched it. One call, one voice. That was all it would take. But fear battled inside him. Fear of being wrong, of bringing judgment down on himself, fear of turning whispers into headlines. He closed his eyes, breathing hard, replaying his father's porch swing words. The corners are where light finds its sharpest edge. Maybe this was the corner. Maybe this was the edge. When he opened his eyes, Linda was watching him, not directly, but enough to know she knew he had seen. Her smirk widened as though daring him to move, daring him to fight back. Noah's jaw tightened. He looked away, forcing himself to breathe. The storm was coming closer. He could feel it. And this time, silence might not be enough. The moment the captain's voice faded, the cabin seemed to inhale and hold its breath. A silence lingered, tense and unnatural, like the air before a thunderstorm. Passengers looked around, uncertain whether to whisper or to wait for something else to follow. Noah Carter sat still in seat 3C, his hands pressed together so tightly his knuckles whitened. His ears rang with the echo of the announcement. He knew exactly why the captain had spoken. He had seen the words Linda Whitman typed, had read the pieces of venom she cloaked in casual sentences. Now that venom had reached the cockpit, infecting the very systems meant to protect the plane. Across the aisle, Linda adjusted the silk scarf around her neck, her expression cool and collected. If anything, she looked pleased. Ethan, her son, remained half asleep, oblivious to the storm brewing around him. To Noah, Linda's calmness was proof enough that she felt untouchable. She had planted the seed of suspicion and now sat back to watch it grow. The seatbelt signs blinked on again. Rachel Lee, the young flight attendant, moved quickly through the aisle to check latches and overhead bins, but her eyes betrayed her nerves. When she passed Noah, she paused just slightly. Their eyes met for a fleeting second. He saw her concern, her quiet confusion, and in that moment he wanted to tell her everything, but fear held him still. The engines hummed louder as the plane cut through a pocket of turbulence. Coffee cups rattled, and a few gasps rose from the cabin. Captain Robert Hayes' voice returned, firm yet composed. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have been asked to make a precautionary diversion to Denver. This is purely procedural. We will update you as soon as more information is available." The words landed like heavy stones in Noah's chest. Diversion. He had flown enough times with his father to know what that meant. A diversion wasn't casual. It wasn't a minor detail. It meant something was wrong, seriously wrong. The whispers began immediately. A businessman in the front row leaned toward his seatmate. "What do you think it is?" Mechanical, a woman with a toddler clutched her child tighter. "Oh God, it's not a threat, is it?" Murmurs swelled like ripples on water, spreading from one row to another until the entire cabin buzzed with speculation. Noah's pulse thundered in his ears. He wanted to shout, to tell them all that it was a lie, that the real danger wasn't him, but the woman 2 seats ahead with a poisonous smile and a phone full of calculated words. But his voice caught in his throat. He imagined the eyes turning on him, the accusing stares, the possibility that even the truth would not save him. Linda glanced over her shoulder briefly, her gaze brushing Noah's face. It was not the look of fear or even of curiosity. It was the look of someone who believed she had already won. The corners of her mouth curled upward. She knew what she had set in motion, and she reveled in it. Rachel returned to the galley and whispered with another attendant. Their hushed tones carried urgency. Occasionally, Rachel's eyes flicked back toward Noah, though quickly she turned away. The unease in her body language was unmistakable. The plane shifted slightly as it began its gradual descent toward Denver. The pilot's steady hand masked the urgency, but Noah had flown enough with his father to recognize the difference between a normal descent and an unscheduled one. This was faster, more deliberate. He swallowed hard, pressing his palms against his thighs. His thoughts spun in frantic circles. Should he make the call? Should he reach for his phone? Press the one number that would change everything? His father's voice echoed again. Sometimes the choice is not whether to speak, but when. The chatter around him grew. A passenger in row 5 muttered about connections missed. Someone else complained loudly about delays, demanding answers. But beneath the irritation was something heavier fear. It seeped through the air like smoke. Rachel approached Linda's row, crouching slightly to speak in a low voice. "Ma'am, is everything all right? We just need to make sure passengers are comfortable during the diversion." Linda smiled, all teeth and polish. "Of course, I understand. Safety first." Her tone dripped with false sweetness. She leaned closer, whispering something Noah couldn't catch. Rachel nodded uncertainly, straightening with a stiff posture. Noah's chest ached. He knew Linda had just fed her another piece of the story, another sliver of her fabricated narrative. With each whisper, the web grew tighter around him. Minutes stretched long. The captain's voice returned once more. "Ladies and gentlemen, please prepare for landing. We will be touching down in Denver within the next 15 minutes. Cabin crew, secure the cabin for arrival." The words sealed it. There was no turning back now. Denver awaited, and with it, whatever judgment Linda's lies had summoned. Noah stared at the seat in front of him, his reflection faint in the glossy screen of the built-in monitor. His own eyes looked back at him, wide and haunted. He whispered silently, as though to himself. "What would you do?" "Dad," and then, as though in answer, a memory surfaced. His father on the porch, the creak of the swing, the weight of his hand on Noah's shoulder. "Noah, People will try to decide your story for you, but remember, this silence gives them the pen. Speak, and you hold it yourself. The plane shuddered slightly as it descended through a cloud bank. The cabin lights dimmed, leaving faces half-shadowed. Noah's resolve hardened. His fear remained, a heavy knot in his chest. But beneath it, something else stirred strength. He reached slowly into his pocket, fingers brushing the smooth surface of his phone. His hand trembled. If he called, the illusion would shatter. The cabin would know who he was, whose son he was, and everything would change. Linda's laughter, quiet and triumphant, carried back to him. It was enough. He tightened his grip on the phone, pulled it out, and stared at the screen. His father's name sat at the top of his recent calls, a lifeline waiting to be pressed. He hesitated only a moment longer before his thumb hovered over the green button. His breath caught in his throat. He wasn't sure what would happen once he pressed it, but he knew this. It was time to take back the pen. Outside, the Denver skyline began to glow through the thinning clouds. A promise and a warning. Inside, the cabin braced for landing, unaware that a single call was about to unravel everything they thought they knew about this flight. The wheels touched the runway with a heavy thud, sending a ripple of motion through the cabin. For a moment, the passengers released a collective sigh, the relief of safe landing overpowering the unease. But the relief was thin, fragile, and quickly replaced with a sharper tension. Everyone knew this wasn't Denver by choice. The plane slowed, engines roaring, flaps lifting as it decelerated. Through the oval windows, the Denver lights stretched in glowing ribbons across the dark horizon. Noah Carter leaned against the cool glass, his reflection staring back at him, pale and uncertain. His chest rose and fell in shallow breaths. He was safe on the ground, yet not safe at all. The captain's voice returned, calm but clipped. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Denver International Airport. For precautionary reasons, we will be met by airport authorities. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until further notice. The murmurs swelled instantly. Passengers turned in their seats, eyes darting with curiosity and suspicion. Some whispered about mechanical issues, others about medical emergencies. But the unspoken fear lingered in every glance. Something or someone was wrong on this flight. Noah sank lower in his seat. He felt the stairs brush against him, like shadows creeping closer. He didn't need to guess who had painted the target. He had seen Linda's texts. He knew the shape of her scheme. Linda Whitman adjusted her blazer, her lips curling with faint satisfaction. She whispered something to Ethan, who blinked awake and rubbed his eyes, confused by the sudden stop. To anyone watching, she looked like a composed, concerned mother. But Noah had seen behind the mask. Rachel Lee moved briskly through the aisle, checking that passengers remained seated. Her face was professional, but her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the back of each chair. When she reached Noah's row, she lingered, her lips parted as if to speak, but then she thought better of it and moved on. The aircraft taxied not to a gate but to a remote stand, far from the main terminal. The unfamiliar scenery outside the window, the wide, empty tarmac, the flashing blue lights in the distance set the cabin buzzing again. Then came the sight that silenced the whispers vehicles approaching. First, the blinking lights of airport police. Then, the stark white van of TSA. Finally, the imposing black SUV of federal security. Noah's stomach dropped. His hands shook as he clutched the boarding pass in his pocket. His father's voice echoed again. "Speak, or they will write your story for you." The engines powered down. The silence inside the cabin was deafening. Every creak of the fuselage seemed magnified. every rustle of clothing like thunder. Passengers held their breath as the sound of footsteps and clattering equipment approached outside. The door opened with a hiss. A blast of cool night air rushed in. 3 uniformed officers stepped on board, their expressions hard and unreadable. Behind them, a TSA supervisor followed, clipboard in hand. The presence of authority filled the narrow aisle like a storm. "Ladies and gentlemen," one officer said firmly, "we're here to conduct a precautionary check. Please remain calm and follow instructions from the crew." Noah's pulse thundered. His eyes flicked to Linda. She sat up straighter, her face carefully schooled into polite concern. She even raised a hand slightly, as if to flag herself as cooperative, but her eyes gleamed with something darker. The officers spoke quietly with Rachel, who gestured toward the forward rows. Noah's breath hitched. He saw at the subtle tilt of her head in his direction. His throat closed. They were coming for him. A chill raced through his body, colder than the air seeping through the open door. His mind screamed at him to act, to speak, to reveal the truth before the lie swallowed him whole. He fumbled for his phone, but his hand shook too hard. The screen blurred through the haze of panic. "Noah," he whispered to himself, forcing the air through his lungs. "Be strong." The officers stepped closer, their heavy shoes thudding against the carpet. Every passenger's eyes followed, some curious, others fearful, a few suspicious. The silence was suffocating. Rachel's face betrayed her unease. She wasn't certain, Noah realized. She wasn't accusing him outright, but Linda's whispers had planted enough doubt to turn precaution into suspicion. One of the officers crouched near Noah's row, his tone firm but not unkind. "Son, we need to ask you a few questions. Can you come with us?" Noah froze. His entire body screamed against moving, against being paraded down the aisle as though he were guilty. He wanted to shout, to declare his innocence, to expose Linda's manipulation. But his voice stuck. His fear chained him to silence. And then, like a lifeline, he remembered his father's words again. "Speak, and you hold the pen." With trembling hands, he pulled the boarding pass from his pocket and held it up. His voice cracked, but it carried, "This is my seat. 2A. She took it. He pointed straight at Linda. Gasps rippled through the cabin. The officers turned, eyes narrowing. Rachel's face flushed as she processed the revelation. Passengers leaned forward, craning to see. Linda laughed lightly, the sound brittle. "Oh, sweetheart, you must be mistaken. That's ridiculous. He's just a child, probably confused." Noah's throat tightened, but he didn't back down. He gripped the boarding pass so tightly the paper crumpled. His voice wavered but held firm. "Check it. My name is on it." She lied. The officer reached for the pass, scanning it under his flashlight. His brows furrowed. He looked at Linda, then back at Noah. The weight of the truth pressed into the silence. For the first time, Linda's smile faltered. The TSA supervisor stepped forward, his tone clipped. "Ma'am, we're going to need to see your boarding documents as well." Linda hesitated, her hand hovering over her bag. Her eyes darted briefly toward the officers, then toward the other passengers, many of whom now stared at her with suspicion. The cracks in her confidence widened. Noah's chest heaved with relief and fear all at once. He had spoken. The truth was out there, fragile but alive. Now, it was up to the authorities to see it. As Linda reluctantly pulled her papers from her bag, the cabin buzzed again with whispers. Passengers exchanged knowing glances, their earlier suspicions shifting, recalibrating. The story was changing before their eyes. The officer compared the documents, his jaw tightening. The evidence was clear. For the first time, Noah felt the faintest glimmer of control. The pen was back in his hand, But he knew the battle wasn't over. Denver was only the beginning. The cabin was no longer silent. The whispering had swelled into a low tide of voices, passengers leaning toward one another, eyes darting between Noah and Linda. Every word Noah had spoken hung in the air, fragile but undeniable. The boarding pass crumpled in his trembling hand was more powerful than any accusation. It was proof. The TSA supervisor held Linda's papers under the cabin light, his brow furrowed. "Ma'am, your boarding pass shows seat 4C, not 2A. His voice was even, but the implication was thunderous. Linda's lips tightened into a strained smile. That must be a mistake. Maybe there was a mix-up at the gate. These things happen. Noah's chest ached with both relief and fear. The truth had been spoken aloud, yet Linda still wielded the weapon of denial. He wanted her to admit it, to apologize, to acknowledge the wrong she had done, but instead she wrapped herself in excuses. The officer's gaze hardened. "Mistake or not, you're in the wrong seat, and you've been sending messages that flagged our system. We'll need to discuss that further once we disembark." A murmur rippled through the passengers. Some shook their heads. Others whispered words like unbelievable and entitled. A woman across the aisle muttered. She knew exactly what she was doing. Linda's face flushed crimson. She turned in her seat, her voice rising just enough to carry. "This is ridiculous. You're all taking the word of a child. He probably doesn't even understand what's happening." The words cut deep, but Noah refused to flinch. He sat straighter, his small frame rigid with defiance. His voice cracked, but rang out clear. "I understand enough. You took my seat and tried to make me look like a problem." The cabin buzzed louder. Some passengers nodded in agreement. Others whispered, recording discreetly on their phones. The tide of public perception was shifting. Rachel Lee stepped forward, her hands clenched nervously at her sides. Her voice trembled, but she forced it out. I saw the boarding pass earlier. He told me the seat was his. I didn't act on it at the time, but he was telling the truth." Noah's chest tightened. For the first time, someone on the crew had acknowledged what he'd endured. Rachel's admission was a crack in the wall of silence. Linda turned on her sharply. "You're siding with him against a paying customer." Rachel's jaw clenched, her voice steadying. "Against injustice. Yes." The passengers erupted in a wave of low applause and murmured approval. For Noah, the sound was like oxygen. He wasn't invisible anymore, but Linda wasn't finished. Her voice rose, sharp and defensive. "Do you people even realize who I am? I have friends on the board of this airline. I contribute to their campaigns. I know people who can make calls that matter. You think one little boy's word is going to outweigh mine?" The arrogance in her tone silenced the cabin for a beat. Then, slowly, the murmurs began again, this time, sharper, angrier. Noah felt the fire rise in his chest. He had been afraid for so long, but the fear was giving way to something stronger, conviction. He stood, his legs shaky but resolute. His small voice cut through the cabin. "I don't need to be bigger than you. I just need to be heard. My name is Noah Carter. My father is Darius Carter. And you thought you could steal my seat because you thought I was nobody." The words exploded like thunder. Gasps shot through the cabin. Phones whipped higher, recording every syllable. Even the officers froze, their eyes widening. Linda's face drained of color. "Carter," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The name carried weight. Darius Carter was not just a billionaire, he was a household name in technology, innovation, and philanthropy. Everyone on that plane knew who he was, and now they knew this boy was his son. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Passengers' whispers turned to outrage, their glares searing into Linda. Someone muttered. She knew. She used him. Another said. Disgusting. Noah's hand shook, but he didn't back down. He lifted the boarding pass higher, his voice firm. I belong here. You don't get to decide that. The TSA supervisor cleared his throat, his voice carrying authority. Ma'am, you'll need to come with us once we deplane. Sir, he turned to Noah, his tone softening. Thank you for your honesty. We'll make sure this is handled properly. Noah nodded faintly, his chest tight. He had spoken, and for once, the world had listened. But then came the sound that made his heart lurch, the buzz of his phone. He looked down and saw the name glowing on the screen. Dad. Passengers around him gasped softly. Even the officers glanced at one another. The timing was uncanny, almost cinematic. With trembling hands, Noah answered. The voice on the other end was deep, calm, unshakable. Noah, are you safe? Tears stung his eyes, but his voice steadied. Yes, Dad. But she took my seat. She tried to make them think I was the problem. The silence on the line was heavy, like the stillness before a storm. Then Darius Carter spoke, each word deliberate. Stay calm. I'm here now. Put me on speaker. Noah obeyed, holding the phone out. The voice filled the cabin, resonant and commanding. This is Darius Carter. My son is on this flight. He was profiled, humiliated, and endangered by lies. I want every word of this recorded. This will not be buried. Passengers gasped again, some whispering, others holding their phones higher to capture every second. The officers stiffened, their professionalism sharpened by the weight of his name. Linda shrank into her seat, her bravado collapsing, her face burned as dozens of eyes pierced through her, no longer seeing her as powerful, but as pitiful. Darius continued. To the crew, know this. Your silence allowed this to happen. And to the woman who thought she could use my son as a pawn, know that actions have consequences. This plane will not leave Denver until this injustice is corrected, and Transatlantic Airways will answer for it. The words reverberated through the cabin like a verdict. Passengers broke into applause, some even cheering. For Noah. The sound washed over him like a tide of validation, erasing the loneliness that had haunted him for hours. Rachel stood taller, her eyes glistening. The officers nodded firmly, stepping back toward Linda. The captain's voice, though calm, betrayed a tremor as it came over the intercom. Mr. Carter, this is Captain Hayes. We hear you loud and clear. Noah exhaled slowly, his body trembling with the release of everything he had held inside. For the first time that night, he wasn't just a boy clutching a crumpled boarding pass. He was his father's son, and his voice mattered. Linda sat frozen, her hands clenched around her designer handbag. For the first time, the mask had shattered completely. The whispers of power and connections meant nothing now. She was exposed, and Noah, small but unyielding, had been the one to do it. The storm had broken, but he knew the real reckoning was only beginning. The cabin vibrated with the weight of Darius Carter's voice, still echoing through the speakerphone. For a few moments after he finished, there was only the sound of the engines cooling and the faint hum of the air circulation system. The passengers, stunned by the revelation, seemed to understand that they were witnesses to something bigger than a seating dispute. Noah sat frozen, the phone still in his hands. His father's calm but commanding tone had steadied him, had reminded him that he wasn't alone. For hours, he had felt invisible, diminished, but now the truth was no longer just his to carry. Everyone on the plane had heard it. The TSA supervisor straightened, his clipboard pressed firmly against his chest. We'll disembark row by row. Officers, Please escort the passenger in 2A. He glanced sharply at Linda and her son. Gasps rustled through the cabin. Linda stiffened, her mouth opening in protest, but the officer's presence at her side silenced her before words could take shape. Her carefully curated aura of control was crumbling. She clutched Ethan's shoulder as if shielding him, though it was clear the gesture was more about clinging to some last shred of dignity. "Wait," she burst out, her voice cracking. "This is absurd. You're humiliating me in front of everyone. He's just a child making wild claims. This is a misunderstanding." The supervisor's expression didn't waver. "Ma'am, you'll have every chance to clarify your side. But not here. Not now." Passengers leaned into the aisle, phones angled discreetly, but clearly recording. The soft glow of screens caught Linda's furious expression, sealing the evidence into dozens of digital archives. Rachel Lee's voice, steadier now than before, cut through the tension. "I saw the boy's boarding pass. This is not a misunderstanding." Her words carried not just truth, but quiet remorse. The tone of someone correcting a wrong they had allowed to fester too long. Linda's eyes burned into Rachel, but the younger woman held her gaze. For once, Linda found no one willing to look away. The line of passengers began to shuffle forward, row by row. When it was Linda's turn, the officers gestured firmly. She rose stiffly, her heels clicking against the cabin floor as though each step resisted gravity. Ethan stumbled slightly as she tugged him along, confusion etched across his young face. Noah watched her pass, his heart pounding. He had dreamed of this moment for hours, the instant when the truth would finally outweigh the lie. Yet seeing Linda reduced to a spectacle didn't bring him joy. It only brought heaviness. Her downfall was the product of her choices, but he couldn't ignore the frightened boy at her side. As Linda and Ethan were led down the aisle, passengers shifted back, some whispering, others watching with cold disapproval. A few shook their heads openly, unable to mask their disgust. Noah felt a gentle hand on his shoulder. Rachel crouched down to meet his eyes. "You did the right thing," she said softly. His throat tightened. He wanted to believe her, but part of him wondered if the right thing should ever feel so heavy. When it was finally his roused turn, Noah stood, legs trembling. He clutched his phone tightly, his father's voice still faintly echoing in his mind. As he stepped into the aisle, a ripple moved through the passengers. A few nodded at him, small gestures of respect. Someone whispered, "That's Carter's son." Another murmured, "Brave kid." The recognition both comforted and unnerved him. For so long, he had wanted to be invisible, to avoid the weight of his father's name. But tonight, that name had been his shield. The officers waited near the exit, their focus still on Linda. She stood just inside the jet bridge, her voice raised in frantic protest. "You don't understand who you're dealing with. I can make calls. I know people who can shut this down." Her voice echoed off the metal walls of the bridge, brittle and desperate. The officers didn't flinch. One of them simply replied, "Ma'am, right now, you need to cooperate." As Noah stepped onto the bridge, the cool Denver night air swept across his face. The space smelled faintly of jet fuel and rain, sharp and metallic. The moment felt surreal, like stepping into a stage where the audience was still waiting for the final act. At the gate, the crowd thickened. Airport security stood in formation, and a small group of airline officials waited with grim expressions. Beyond them, clusters of passengers pressed against the terminal glass, watching with wide eyes as though witnessing a drama they'd only read about in headlines. Linda's protests grew shriller. "This is harassment. I was just trying to sit with my son. That boy, he exaggerated everything." The TSA supervisor raised a hand, silencing her. "Enough. We'll continue this in private." He nodded to the officers, who guided her firmly toward a waiting room. The spectacle left a hush in its wake. Every eye now turned to Noah. The weight of their attention pressed hard on his shoulders, but before he could shrink beneath it, a voice cut through the silence. Noah. He turned sharply. There, striding down the jet bridge with the calm gravity of someone used to commanding entire boardrooms, was his father. Darius Carter's presence filled the space, not through volume or showmanship, but through sheer steadiness. His dark suit, his controlled stride, his eyes locked firmly on his son. It was enough to make the entire gate seem to shift around him. Noah's throat closed as tears threatened. Dad. Darius knelt, wrapping his son in his arms. For a long moment, the world disappeared. The crowd, the officials, the officers, they were only background noise. All that mattered was the solidity of his father's embrace and the low, steady reassurance in his ear. You did everything right. I'm proud of you. Noah's tears spilled then, not from fear, but from the release of holding himself together for so long. When Darius rose, his eyes turned sharp. He faced the airline officials, his voice calm but resonant. You allowed my son to be profiled, humiliated, and endangered. This is not simply a customer service failure. This is systemic negligence. And it ends tonight. The officials shifted uncomfortably under his gaze. One cleared his throat. Mr. Carter, we're deeply sorry. We'll review this immediately. Darius's eyes hardened. Not review. Reform. I'll be speaking with your CEO before the night is over. Contracts will be reconsidered, policies rewritten, and those who enabled this will answer for it. The crowd beyond the glass erupted in murmurs, phones held aloft to capture every word. The spectacle had moved from the cabin to the gate, and now it was live, shared, undeniable. Noah stood close to his father, feeling both the shield of his presence and the weight of the moment. He had wanted only to reclaim his seat, his dignity. Now he realized the fight was far larger. Linda's voice echoed faintly from the room she'd been escorted to, muffled by the walls, but still sharp. Yet no one turned to her anymore. The spotlight had shifted entirely. Darius placed a steady hand on Noah's shoulder, guiding him toward the waiting area. Cameras flashed from the crowd behind the glass. He didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned down to his son and whispered, "Remember this, Noah, justice isn't about punishment alone. It's about making sure this never happens again." Noah nodded, his small chest swelling with the gravity of the lesson. Tonight had taught him what it meant to be invisible, but also what it meant to be seen and to choose the right moment to speak. As they stepped into the terminal, the hum of voices followed them, charged with awe, outrage, and anticipation. The reckoning had begun, and neither father nor son intended to let it fade quietly into the night. The terminal was alive with a restless energy that night, the kind of buzz that usually followed weather delays or celebrity sightings. But this was different. This was sharper, heavier, as if the air itself carried the weight of injustice being pulled into the light. As Noah and his father stepped into the wide, sterile corridor, the low hum of voices swelled into a storm. Passengers who had deplaned ahead lingered at the edges, whispering and pointing. Travelers waiting at nearby gates craned their necks, their screens already glowing with social media feeds. The story of Flight 1783 was spreading in real time, carried on shaky videos and breathless captions. "Is that him?" a woman murmured to her companion, phone raised discreetly. "That's Carter's boy." "Can you believe it?" another voice answered. Noah's cheeks burned under the sudden attention. He wanted to disappear, to slip into invisibility again, but his father's steady hand on his shoulder kept him anchored. Darius Carter walked with unhurried confidence, his gaze forward, his presence commanding without a single word. Security officers flanked them discreetly, guiding them toward a private waiting area. But the crowd pressed closer, curiosity tugging at their feet. Some clapped quietly as they passed. Others offered nods of solidarity. For Noah, every gesture was a strange mix of validation and suffocation. Inside the waiting lounge, the noise dulled, replaced by the sterile hum of fluorescent lights. A handful of airline executives stood waiting, their suits rumpled, their faces drawn with the fatigue of late-night crisis management. They looked like men and women who had been summoned against their will but knew they could not refuse. "Mr. Carter," one began, his voice thick with rehearsed contrition. "Please allow us to extend our deepest apologies on behalf of Transatlantic Airways." This incident, Darius raised a hand, silencing him. His voice, low and precise, carried more authority than any shouted demand. "This incident is not an accident. It is a symptom. You don't apologize for symptoms, you treat the disease." The executives shifted uneasily, exchanging glances. One cleared his throat. "We understand your frustration, sir. We'll investigate fully. There will be accountability." Darius's eyes narrowed. Accountability isn't a press release. It isn't a quiet suspension buried in paperwork. It is action that prevents the next Noah Carter from being profiled, humiliated, and silenced. Can you deliver that? The question hung like a blade in the air. None of them answered immediately. Their silence spoke volumes. Noah sat close to his father, listening, his small hands clasped tightly in his lap. He had never seen Darius in this mode, not just a father, but a force. The calm he carried was not passive. It was the calm of someone who knew storms bent around him. But even as admiration swelled in Noah's chest, so did unease. This wasn't only about him anymore. His pain had become part of something larger, something that demanded more than apologies. Could he carry that weight? Did he want to? The door opened suddenly, breaking the tension. Reporters surged forward before security contained them, their voices overlapping in a chaotic chorus. "Mr. Carter, will you sue the airline? Do you believe this was racial profiling? How is your son doing tonight?" Noah shrank into his chair, the noise pressing in like a wave. He hated the flash of cameras, the way they caught him mid-blink, mid-breath, turning his exhaustion into spectacle. But Darius rose slowly, positioning himself between the cameras and his son. His voice cut through the clamor. "My son is safe. That is my priority. But safety without dignity is not safety at all." Tonight, a boy was told without words that he did not belong in the seat he paid for, in the world he lives in. That is not just my family's fight. That is everyone's fight. The cameras clicked furiously. Reporters scribbled. Phones streamed. The words were already escaping the walls, heading into living rooms and feeds across the country. Noah watched, his chest tightening. His father's voice was strong, steady, undeniable. Yet it scared him too, because it meant there was no going back. This night would not fade quietly. It would become part of the Carter legacy, part of his identity whether he wanted it or not. The executives tried again, fumbling for control. "Mr. Carter, please, let's discuss this privately." "We're prepared to offer significant restitution." Darius cut him off with a glance so sharp it silenced the room. "Restitution does not buy back dignity. You think you can write a check and close the book, but the book is wide open, and it is being read aloud right now by millions." The man swallowed hard, his shoulders sagging. Noah leaned closer to his father, whispering so only he could hear, "Dad, I just wanted my seat back." Darius's eyes softened as he looked at his son. For a moment, the iron melted, replaced by the warmth of a father's love. He crouched down, lowering his voice. "I know, Noah. But sometimes the smallest seat holds the biggest fight. Tonight you showed courage most adults never find." Noah's throat ached. He wanted to believe it, but doubt gnawed at him. Had he been courageous or simply too afraid to stay silent any longer? Outside the lounge, the muffled roar of the crowd grew. Hashtags were trending, videos going viral, narratives forming. Some showed Noah's trembling hands clutching the boarding pass. Others captured Linda's arrogance, her words of entitlement, her face as the truth cornered her. The world was already choosing sides, and Noah, for better or worse, was at the center. As the minutes stretched, officials shuffled papers, lawyers whispered in corners, and the airline executives retreated into crisis calls. But Darius never wavered. He stood steady, answering questions with precision, demanding commitments instead of platitudes. Noah sat quietly, absorbing it all. The terminal lights glared harshly, his eyes stung with fatigue, but his mind was wide awake. He thought of Linda's smug smile, the way she had looked at him like he was invisible. He thought of Rachel's voice finally speaking up, shaky but brave. He thought of the passengers clapping softly as he stood, as if they had all been waiting for him to claim his own story. And he thought of his father's words, "Justice isn't about punishment alone, it's about making sure this never happens again." Noah shifted in his chair, his hands unclenching. Maybe he didn't ask for this fight, but maybe, just maybe, he could help carry it. Not just because he was Darius Carter's son, but because he was Noah, a boy who refused to disappear. He took a deep breath and whispered to himself, so softly no one else could hear, "I won't be invisible again." The lounge door opened once more, and the hum of cameras surged back. This time, Noah didn't shrink. He sat taller, steady in his seat. The story wasn't finished yet, but for the first time, he believed he had the strength to see it through. The Denver terminal had quieted by the time the Carter family was escorted to a private conference room. The late-night crowds had thinned, though echoes of the earlier uproar lingered in every corner. Screens still flashed headlines, Flight 1783 grounded after seat dispute. Billionaire Darius Carter confronts airline bias. 9-year-old Noah Carter becomes symbol of dignity. Noah sat on a leather couch, his small frame swallowed by the oversized cushions. His mind was racing, but his body was heavy, drained from the long hours of confrontation and exposure. He stared at the muted television, where his own face appeared in shaky passenger footage. It was surreal, like watching someone else's story, someone else's fear. Darius entered the room, trailed by 2 airline executives whose smiles were brittle, their eyes shadowed with exhaustion. They carried folders, contracts, promises wrapped in paper. Noah could tell his father had already read through their offers by the way he walked, measured, calm, in control. "We're prepared to make a formal statement," one of the executives said. "Linda Whitman has been banned from flying with Transatlantic Airways permanently. The crew members involved will undergo immediate review, and we're launching a task force on bias training." Darius studied them in silence. Then he spoke with the same even tone that had both comforted Noah and unsettled boardrooms across the world. Task forces fade, headlines fade, but systems remain. You don't need a task force. You need accountability written into your operating DNA. The executives glanced at one another. One began to protest, but Darius continued. "You don't sell tickets. You sell trust. Tonight, you broke it. If you want to rebuild it, you'll put structures in place so that no one, no child, no passenger ever has to prove their humanity at 30,000 feet. There was no threat in his words, but Noah could feel the weight of them. They weren't a suggestion, they were an ultimatum. After a tense silence, the older executive nodded. "We'll commit to a full review," Independent oversight, transparent reporting. If you're willing, Mr. Carter, we'd like your guidance. Darius allowed himself the faintest smile. Not guidance, partnership. My family will not be props in your apology, but we will hold you to your promises. The deal was sealed not with handshakes, but with the gravity of truth. The executives withdrew, leaving father and son alone in the quiet room. Noah shifted uneasily. Dad, does it always have to be this big? Couldn't it have just ended with me getting my seat back? Darius sat beside him, his gaze softening. It could have. But then nothing changes. You'd carry the hurt. She'd carry her entitlement, and this airline would keep pretending nothing was wrong. Sometimes life gives you a moment. Noah. And what you choose in that moment shapes more than just yourself. Noah looked down at his hands, remembering how they had trembled on the boarding pass. He thought of Linda's sneer, Rachel's hesitant defense, the passengers clapping as if to say, "We see you." Slowly. He nodded. "I was scared," he whispered. "Courage isn't the absence of fear," Darius said gently. "It's the decision to stand anyway. You did that tonight." Noah let the words settle in his chest. For the first time since the ordeal began, he felt a flicker of pride, fragile but real. Hours later, when they finally left the airport, the night air was cool against Noah's face. Outside the private exit, reporters still waited, their cameras like a wall of light. Darius placed a protective arm around his son. One reporter called out, "Mr. Carter, what do you want people to take away from tonight?" Darius paused, his voice carrying in the hush. "That dignity is not negotiable. That the smallest seat can hold the largest truth, and that no child should have to fight to be seen." The words rippled outward, echoing into microphones, headlines, hashtags. Back at their hotel, Noah lay awake, replaying everything. He wondered what kids at school would say when they saw the videos. He wondered if Ethan Whitman would remember him not as a rival, but as a boy who didn't give up his place. He wondered if Linda understood the damage she had done, not just to him, but to herself, to her son. Sleep finally came, heavy and uneven, but in his dreams, Noah wasn't invisible anymore. He was standing tall, boarding pass in hand, walking toward his seat without fear. In the days that followed, the story exploded across the country. News programs debated systemic bias in travel. Passengers shared their own stories of being profiled, ignored, or dismissed. Hashtags multiplied. Gerency 2A, dignity in the air. Noah Carter. Transatlantic Airways scrambled to recover, announcing sweeping reforms, mandatory anti-bias training, real-time complaint systems, independent audits. They unveiled a Carter Initiative Fund to support youth access to travel and education, naming it not out of flattery, but necessity. For Noah, life shifted in ways he couldn't fully grasp. At school, classmates treated him with a mix of awe and curiosity. Some whispered, others asked for details, but a few offered quiet solidarity, kids who had felt invisible too. Darius handled the press, the partnerships, the negotiations. But at home, he was simply Dad, reminding Noah to do his homework, making pancakes on Saturday mornings, sitting with him when the noise of the world felt too loud. One evening, as they watched the sunset from their balcony, Noah asked softly, "Do you think it really changed anything?" Darius looked at him with that calm certainty that seemed to anchor everything. "Yes, because change begins when one person refuses to move from the seat that is rightfully theirs. You did that, and now others will too." Noah felt a swell of something deep and steady inside him, not just relief, but purpose. He realized the story wasn't only about what was taken from him, it was about what he had claimed: his dignity, his visibility, his voice. Years from now, the details of Flight 1783 might fade, but the lesson etched itself into Noah's heart that even in the sky, thousands of feet above the earth, justice must have a seat. And that night, on the quiet streets of Denver, a boy who had once feared disappearing walked taller, his shadow no longer something to hide in, but something to grow into. Sometimes, the smallest battles leave the deepest marks. A boy, no older than 9, refused to surrender his seat, and in that refusal, he spoke for millions who have been told, in ways both loud and silent, that they do not belong. Noah Carter's fight was never just about a window seat in first class. It was about dignity, about visibility, about the right to exist without compromise. And what about us, the passengers in our own lives, watching from the sidelines? Are we clapping softly as injustice unfolds, or are we standing firmly beside those who dare to resist it? The story of Flight 1783 is a reminder that prejudice still boards with us, often disguised as procedure or convenience. But it is also a reminder that courage can board too, and when it does, it changes everything. As you reflect on this journey, let the lesson linger: justice is not a luxury, and dignity is not negotiable. Tonight, we witnessed a child and his father transform pain into purpose. Tomorrow, it could be your voice or your silence that shapes what happens next. If this story moved you, if it stirred anger, compassion, or hope, don't let it fade when the screen goes dark. Carry it forward. Share it. Discuss it. Challenge it. And join us again for the next story that demands to be told. Remember to like, share, and subscribe, because together we can keep these conversations alive and ensure that dignity always has a seat.